No. There's the answer to your question. You can click off the video if you want. I'm only joking. I will explain myself. For a bit of context, George Russell joined Mercedes at the beginning of 2022 from Williams after spending a few years there waiting for that seat to open up. So far, he has outscored Lewis Hamilton across the races we've had. And, the question has to be asked, is he now the Mercedes #1 driver? Before I explain why I don't think he is, let me just say George Russell has been incredible at Mercedes so far. I think to come in and outscore Lewis Hamilton in your first season is a great achievement. And he has been very close to Lewis on pace. And I do appreciate how good that is. But in my opinion, I still don't think he's #1 or can be considered #1 just yet. Let me explain myself. Firstly, Lewis Hamilton is a 7-time world champion. There's no other way of putting it. He is the most decorated driver in the sport's history. 7 titles, 103 Grand Prix wins, 103 pole positions, and 191 podiums. That over a 15-year career. I mean, I think that on its own, that history is enough to warrant him being the team's #1 for the foreseeable future. And I think even now, Toto talks about Lewis winning his 8th title. They want to get Lewis that 8th title. And I think there's a clear focus on that team on getting Lewis that 8th title rather than getting George his first. He's also been with the team for over a decade. He's now had 203 race starts for them, which is the most of any driver ever for a single team. Like Lewis says, sometimes it's like a family to him at this point. And I think they consider him as part of that family. So really, the only way he could not be #1 in that team is if George was outperforming him or Lewis was underperforming and there was no real sort of either explanation or, indication of why that might be the case. It was just unexplained drop-off, basically. So obviously we saw, George has outscored him so far, but has he actually outperformed Lewis? Let's talk about that. So from Australia to Canada, George significantly outperformed Lewis as Mercedes sort of came to terms with the whole porpoising problem they were having at the beginning of last year. George finished top 5 in every single race, and Lewis did have some shockers. He went out in Q1 in Saudi Arabia, and he finished P14 in Imola. But context does matter. There are a couple of factors here that play into that. Firstly, slightly less important, Lewis did have a lot of bad luck. Safety cars in Australia and Miami screwed him out of positions where he was ahead of George and probably would have finished ahead of him. Spain, he had contact with K-Mag that dropped him down to last place with a puncture. And in that race, he had unbelievable pace. He actually finished closer to the front than he was after his puncture and was at the back, which showed he really did have podium or race-winning pace at that point. Secondly, he was running on experimental setups. Now, this is a bit more important than the luck more than anything. Luck is part of Formula One after all. But the team was very vocal about the fact that Lewis was running experimental setups and compromising himself in order to understand the team's problems. Now, he put himself as the team leader at this stage by spurring the team forward and constantly sacrificing his own races to improve the team. That's clear #1 behavior. That's the experienced behavior. While George is churning out those P5s, Lewis is working out what's wrong, essentially. And I think even though he was being beaten during this period, it's fairly clear to see he was still #1, but because of the leadership role he took on. And after this early part of the season, when Mercedes sort of either began to understand their problems or stopped experimenting as much with Lewis, in Canada onwards, guess what happened? Lewis started to outperform George, consistently. He scored 5 podiums in a row, 3 P3s and 2 P2s, beating George in every single race on merit. Bar Silverstone, where George was eliminated on lap 1. But even then, I think Lewis had race-winning pace, and I'm not sure that George would have been able to match him, but we'll never know on that one. There was a lot of discourse about whether or not those experimental setups were just excuses, but Canada onwards, the clear increase in performance, it's fair to say, I think, that's a factor that was playing in. That took us into the summer break, and after the summer break, Lewis was actually outperformed by George 5-4 in the races. But again, I think context matters here. Belgium, Lewis's fault, he DNF'd, his bad. The Dutch Grand Prix, he kind of got Ferrari'd a bit. Yeah, he got left out on older tyres while George got softs and Max had softs. So there's nothing really I think he could do in that situation. He just couldn't finish ahead of anyone because he had those hard tyres on. There you go. It is what it is. Italy, he took an engine penalty, but so did George in Singapore. So evens out there. Brazil, I think George pretty much outperformed him fair and square, to be honest. I think the incident with Max that Lewis had definitely hindered him and maybe stopped him challenging for the race win in the same way. But after the safety car at the end, George did maintain that gap. So I think George did a fantastic job there. No questions there. And in Abu Dhabi, he had a mechanical issue when he was probably going to finish ahead of George. And I think, you look at all of that and you're like, these aren't signs of a driver being completely outperformed, or at least being outperformed without any reason. There's clearly context and explanations as to why Lewis wasn't doing as well. And don't get me wrong, George on some weekends has been quicker. Like I've said, Brazil. But I think overall, Lewis has been quicker, but he's just not had things go his way, or, he's made the odd mistake, which is his fault, of course. So, end of the day, as impressive as George was in 2022, Lewis, I think, was faster overall and outperformed him most of the time when experimental setups weren't being run. Points didn't really reflect the performance last year. I think that's fair to say. And looking at the early part of this year, George has actually beaten Lewis in every single qualifying session, Q1, Q2, Q3, every single one in every single race so far. But the margins are tiny. We're talking less than a tenth. And I think Lewis's strength does lie in the race with tire management and just overall consistency. In Bahrain, he was quicker in the race. He spent most of his race sort of with Alonso stuck behind Sainz, but he did finish 2 positions ahead of George, and he was quicker overall. Saudi, George definitely was way quicker in qualifying, and Lewis was not as quick in the race. I think it was fairly even. It was close, but I think George had the edge. But I think his strategy also then didn't help, especially after the early bit when his tyres started to fade away compared to George's. And Australia, I don't think we'll ever know because George had his engine failure. But it's clear to see that Lewis did have great pace. He held off Alonso, despite Alonso, I think, probably having a slightly quicker car. So again, so far, hard to say who's been better, but I think it's clear to say that Lewis hasn't been outperformed really so far. In qualifying, maybe, but the margins are so small. This is not to take away from George. I do think George will be the number one in that team in the future, but it's not happened yet. And I just don't see it happening until either Lewis retires or has a significant drop-off in performance consistently, not just race to race. George has out-qualified, has outscored Lewis, but overall, I think just with this context I've explained, I don't think we can justify saying George is number one at Mercedes just yet. That's especially with the success that Lewis has had with that team in the past and the number of times he's proven just how great he is. George will fight for a title if you give him the car. I think he will be a world champion. But for now, he'll have to wait his turn until Lewis decides to call it. I hope you enjoyed. And I know I made another video about Lewis Hamilton or Mercedes, but hey, it's an interesting topic to talk about. So allow me. If you enjoyed, do like and subscribe and comment what you think about George Russell being number one. On that note, that's all from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.